To this webinar on education during COVID-19, precarity, privilege, and purpose. I want to thank colleagues from the School of Education here at NUI Galway for coming forward to arrange this event, which we're very much looking forward to. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute. And the Moore Institute, together with other institutes in the university, have created COVID-19 response groups. And this is part of a series that we've prepared. Two previous webinars have taken place. The first was on social and political questions related to the crisis, and then a second last week on data and ethics. And videos of both of those webinars are available through our Moore Institute web channel, YouTube web channel, and you can click through our website. So I'd now like to hand over to our chair for today's session, Manuela Heinz. So Manuela, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I'm looking forward to chairing this session. And the first thing I'd like to do is to introduce our panelists who will come onto the screen. If you can turn on your videos, everybody. So my name is Dr. Manuela Heinz. I'm the Joint Director of our Postgraduate Initial Teacher Education Program for second-level teachers, the Professional Master of Education, and my own current research focuses on teacher learning, ethical professionalism, and diversity in the teaching profession. We have on the panel Dr. Clíona Murray, Dr. Cornelia Connolly, Dr. Tony Hall, and Dr. Ian Munday. Dr. Clíona Murray teaches sociology of education and sociolinguistics in the School of Education, and her research interests include educational disadvantage, inclusive teaching, gender in education, and teacher professionalism. Dr. Cornelia Connolly teaches on our mathematics and computer science teacher education programs and researches in the area of STEM education with particular emphasis on the technology aspect of STEM. Dr. Tony Hall is the deputy head of our School of Education, and his research focuses on the design of innovation and technology in education, and he teaches English methodology, ICT, research methods, and history of education. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ian Munday, who teaches philosophy of education in our school. He's the director of undergraduate teacher education programs, and his research has focused on various approaches to performatives and performativities in education. And Ian is currently convener of the Philosophy of Education Network at the European Conference of Educational Research. So everybody is very welcome, and I look forward to the discussion. Our topic today is education during COVID-19, precarity, privilege, and purpose. And Dr. Cliona Murray will start with a short introduction to that topic, looking at some recent research and questions. And after that, we will have a panel discussion building on this introduction, followed by an open session where we invite questions from the audience. So we're looking forward to discussions with everybody. And I'm handing over to Dr. Cliona Murray.
Thank you, Manuela. So I suppose in education, as in other domains at the moment, the challenge in many ways is to find that fine balance between, on the one hand, the need for quick decisions and immediate actions in the face of the crisis, such as the decision to close schools. And then on the other hand, there's this need for reflection on the broader implications of those decisions, both now and then also in the longer term. So I suppose by now, the initial rush by parents and educators to put structures in place has subsided a little. And we're kind of looking towards either prolonged continued closures or the tentative reopening of schools. And there's a number of questions to consider. So broadly, there is this newly experienced sense of precarity. And for families with young children, I suppose the loss of the routine of schooling kind of adds to that feeling of uncertainty. But then again, let's not forget that precarity isn't actually that new an experience for some young people, particularly young people from marginalized groups who are experiencing homeless or indirect provision and so forth. So there is recognition broadly that this COVID-19 pandemic is not actually as indiscriminate as was claimed initially, and some groups are impacted more severely than others. And this is also very much the case for the closure of schools. The impact is uneven. And certainly, some families are in a privileged position in being able to provide at least some form of stability for their children's learning at this time, relative to others whose lives have become even more precarious than they were before. And the longer that these school closures go on, the more likely it is that educational inequalities, which are already pervasive, will become more exacerbated. Just as an aside here, as a kind of caveat, although much of the commentary on homeschooling and on school closure in general positions it as an international phenomenon, the conversation does focus on these challenges very much from the perspective of the global north. being able to engage in homeschooling at all, especially a digital version of it, is in itself a relative privilege that is not necessarily available to young people in much of the global south. And I think that's important to remember in the conversation. And in Ireland, schools and other education institutions were closed on March the 12th. And at present, it looks unlikely that schools will return before summer, despite calls to reopen some primary schools at least. Effectively, what this means is that students will have been out of school for nearly 6 months when the new academic year starts in September. And one of the problems from the beginning of the closure and still now is that there's a lack of consistency across schools and even within schools. There's excellent work, really excellent work being done by many teachers at the moment, and that does have to be recognised. But the levels of school and teacher readiness, capacity and resourcing necessary for a turn to online teaching varies enormously. So what are schools actually doing at the moment? So the IPPN, the Irish Primary Principals Network, carried out some research, and 75% of teachers in their survey and in their research are in some form of contact with students at least weekly. And some students are accessing synchronous content, that is virtual teacher-led classes. But the most common activities do tend to be either asynchronous or offline completely. So we're looking at reading, writing, and class workbooks, and for younger children, art and baking. And the majority of school contact is carried out by email or by text. And so I'd bring in a note of caution here regarding the term homeschooling. Homeschooling as a deliberate choice is a very different thing to the type of learning at home that we're seeing currently, just as online teaching is very different to the distribution of homework tasks via email. And in a time when anxiety levels are already elevated, this type of pressure around learning from home or homeschooling is another source of anxiety for families. So according to principals in that survey, parents of all backgrounds are contacting schools in relation to feeling overwhelmed and uncertain. So there's a need certainly for sensitivity to family circumstances, and that the pressure to provide for learning at home doesn't create an additional burden. There's also issues to be addressed around access. So access to broadband and devices for digital learning, but also access to physical space in which to learn. And for some children, even to basic resources like copybooks and writing materials. Then there's no guarantee that parents are in any position to support learning, be it because of their own educational attainment or other work and caring commitments, or even all of the above. Concern for pupils' mental health and well-being has been to the fore in terms of what's being raised by schools and by parents. And it's interesting so that in all of this, academic progress, while a concern obviously, is not necessarily the main worry. The focus is more on the social and relational aspects of schooling. So, and then for some students whose lives were already affected by precarity, we can see clearly now, or even more clearly now, I suppose, the important role that school can play in terms of offering routine and structure and even sanctuary to children for whom home is not a safe place. So there are questions then to tease out around these really immediate and very practical issues of access, equity and privilege. But also, now that schools are shut, we're perhaps more sharply aware of how the role of school in young people's lives actually encompasses far more than just academic outcomes. So there are broader questions to be raised here as well around, what is it that we consider the purpose of education to be, and whether returning to schooling as normal is what we even want after all of this. And I'll hand over to my colleagues maybe to explore some of those issues in more depth.
Thank you very much, Cliona, for this very interesting introduction. And I want to follow on from this and invite colleagues to our discussion. So there are certainly many questions arising in this current situation, and it seems that everything has changed. A lot of the time we talk about homeschooling, online schooling, and suddenly these are some sort of new normal, even though Cliona has highlighted already the problematic nature even of these terminologies. But certainly teachers, schools and parents are all trying really to make sense of what is happening and make the most to cope with this current situation of the closure with schools. And I think what really occupies a lot of our minds a lot of the time is really to figure out what that closure means for our children. What is it that is now missing? What needs to be replaced? How much learning should our children do at home? And really ultimately, as Cliona has already referred to, what is the purpose of education? So I would like to maybe address these questions to Ian firstly. Is this a time where we ask questions about the purpose of education, where our understandings in relation to the purpose might even change? What is the purpose of education? Ian, have you your camera turned on even? Ian, your video? I don't seem to see Ian there. Cornelia and Tony. Okay.
Manuela, I could pick up that question, and I suppose that certainly this is an emergency situation for all in education across primary, early childhood, secondary, third level. And really for the moment, it's to try to kind of have some stability and clarity. I suppose it was very welcome in many respects yesterday, the Minister providing clarity around the junior cycle and what will happen there. Again, it's very hard for us to plan for the immediate and for the future in terms of how we're going to even assess education, notwithstanding how we will actually teach and how learning will be supported. And as Clíona said just there as well, it highlights all the aspects of schooling that are so important. And it isn't just formal instruction, the formal class time, it's all the aspects. And again, we're living in a time, I suppose, that it is unprecedented, but in 1918, which is largely kind of a forgotten pandemic. And again, part of that was because people were it was such a traumatic moment in human history, what had happened in 1918 and 1919, that people wanted to forget it, certainly pretty much as quickly as possible. There was perhaps an opportunity maybe to rethink education, and that's what we have now as well, is to reconsider what the purpose of education might be. And as Clíona said previously as well, all of the aspects of schooling, like mental health as well, and not just the performative aspects, as I'm sure Ian will discuss with us as well, the performative aspects of assessment, which are part of the system. And if we think back as well, just picking up one of the very interesting comments Clíona made about educational disadvantage, one of probably the most transformative moment in the history of education in this country, or one of them, was the introduction of the free second level education scheme in 1966, when it was announced in September 1966. And back then, the minister and government knew, and it was well known, that unless you addressed underlying social and economic exclusion and disadvantage, the chances of success could be very limited. And alongside the introduction of free second level, of course, we had the free bus scheme. So the actual physical infrastructure as well as the educational being so important. So we have to be very careful and very sensitive to the fact that there are disparities and disadvantages in our society, and they get perpetuated into access to education as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Tony B. Have you now, Ian, if you turn on your microphone as well, we can hear you. So I posed a question, I think that really relates very much to the philosophical perspective. And I think these questions are arising now, maybe in a very practical way, but really, what is the purpose? What needs replacement now that the schools are closed?
Okay, let's hopefully won't disappear again. So I should begin by saying that it feels in a way somewhat premature to make any confident claims about how the current crisis will alter our ways of thinking about the purposes of education. So attempts at prescience may easily backfire, and I think it's important to be tentative here. Now, the crisis has undoubtedly led to a disturbance in what is ordinary and normal. This experience of the uncanny, where the ordinary is rendered strange, may itself be educational. I mean, holidays aren't holidays anymore, Saturdays aren't Saturdays, and education understood in its popular sense isn't really education. So, and that popular sense of what education is and is for is bound to the culture of managerialism and performativity, where the purpose, if this is an educational purpose at all, is to achieve what Lyotard called the best possible input-output equation, where here the measure of a good education is improved exam results. But so currently schools and teachers are either rushing to get to grips with new technologies, sending packs out to families where what is done cannot be supervised or assessed, or in some cases not doing anything much at all. And none of these options can possibly marry with the fantasies of a smoothly run, highly efficient system. So then what does that make room for? And I want to start in an optimistic kind of spirit with this. The stuttering and stalling within the system has perhaps made space for a more holistic education, where the focus is not on measurable outcomes, but on broader concerns relating to finding out what's worthwhile, for example, maturing perhaps, or coming to know. So while children may be struggling to prepare for paper qualifications, they may simultaneously become qualified in a broader sense to do all sorts of things. So here I refer to the richer understanding of qualification as a function or purpose of education that's advanced by the educational theorist Gert Biester. Now, skills and abilities, therefore, related to cooking or sewing or gardening, to name just a few of the things that might be happening now, will be developed and honed in ways which do not reflect compliance with a series of criteria, as is sometimes, perhaps often the case with schooling. There is no test being passed other than being able to do the thing you've been trying to do. So, and the last thing I want to say on the optimistic note about this movement away from performativity culture is that children may encounter parts of their world that otherwise would have been ignored due to the sort of tunnel vision that is a central feature of performativity culture. So take my nieces, all under the age of 10 in York, not so long ago yet, so very long ago, I think, for them, they would have made a beeline for the playground with its even contours, its health and safety matting, and obvious, effectively realized pleasures. With this option now declared out of bounds, they are now climbing trees. Children, at least some of them, will be taking roads less traveled by and expanding their relationships with and connections to the world. This sort of experience, I think, is surely educational. But with all that in mind, whilst education and its sense of possibilities and purpose may in some regard be moving away from performativity culture, they might simultaneously be dragged down by centripetal forces of performativity. So to butcher a line from the Godfather 3, as education tries to get out, performativity may pull it back in. In this regard, consider that the crisis has created hitherto unknown possibilities for voracious forms of parenting. Mums and dads have an unprecedented opportunity to manufacture their children into more efficient little learning machines. Second, the door has been opened for an even greater incursion of learning technologies into children's education, and this may lead to a sharpening of focus and an intensification as regards narrowing the educational experience. Teachers, if only temporarily, may be transformed into the manager's fantasy facilitator, the one who watches over the machines. Lastly, a more draconian form of socialization has become necessary, and it may be, who knows, be difficult to break free of that. This may be excellent news for those managers and teachers who crave stricter discipline. Now they will have docile bodies in their classrooms who will comply and achieve. But this could be bad news for the development of, say, autonomous citizens. With that in mind, we may consider the possibility that youthful energy currently suppressed will surely need to find an outlet, perhaps. So to conclude that point, or the point that I'm making, I guess, about this, education may be caught in a tug of war in regards to its purposes.
Okay, thank you so much, Ian, for this insightful elaboration around the purpose of education, and I guess the struggle between performativity and maybe liberation in some way where there is new possibilities. You've also mentioned technology, and certainly that is another thing that we hear a lot about: online teaching and computers and devices and all the challenges and opportunities associated with that. And I'd like to maybe go over to Cornelia as an expert in that field and how technology can enhance education, but possibly if you could talk about both sides a little bit like Ian just did, you know, what are the possibilities here, but what are currently maybe also the challenges or the difficulties?
That's a great question, Manuela, and thanks. Yeah, the COVID-19 and the school closures, it really has highlighted the complex relationship that we have between technology and education. And as Cliona mentioned, the response of schools and of teachers to the crisis, you know, has really been characterized by diverse reactions in terms of full-scale online distance learning, full conferencing facilities at one end of the spectrum, through to the traditional paper-based worksheet activity that students are maybe expected to complete individually, at the other end. But I think we have to keep in mind and bear in mind that this is and was an emergency situation. So it's certainly not an experiment or an evaluation of online learning. This was a rapid shift to what Chuck Hodges and others have termed emergency remote teaching, and it was a necessity. So again, we really can't kind of evaluate online learning for primary or post-primary education at this moment in time. I don't think it's a time for ed tech triumph either. It's really an opportunity for us to consider, for all of us, educational technology companies, educators, to acknowledge the uncertainty and be circumspect on what educational technology can achieve. Because we've certainly seen evidence of the haphazard nature of technology provision across the continuum. And we're certainly, all of us are aware of the digital divide that exists. And there's been great work in providing access to machines and devices. But I think we have to be kind of maybe more cognizant and aware of the digital use divide. So it's not about having access, but it's about possessing the skills and the competency to use the devices and online tools. So ensuring that teachers and students understand how to use the technology as a tool, to engage in creative and productive learning rather than just consuming passive content. There's no doubt about it, we can speed up the process of content delivery, but that's completely different. And, we can't speed up the process of learning. Jelly Salmon refers to Education 4.0 as merging the best of technology and the best of human teaching. And we really, I think, now's perhaps an opportunity for those that can and to really think about the use of digital technology for what it has to offer, for the efficiency, the communication, engagement, but most of all for the authentic and valued educational experience. So for now, we have to be mindful of short-term fixes, but but with long-term solutions and positive, meaningful approaches using the tools available locally and globally. And a number of schools have certainly demonstrated that and have overcome, the traditional barrier of space and time, and that's been highly effective.
Yeah, and I think that links in with what Ian said as well, the importance for, and Clíona mentioned it, the importance of the contact and school as a socialization function. So certainly even using maybe quite basic technology tools would help teachers to at least stay in contact with the students. It's unfortunate that it seems like that's not happening in all the cases yet when we listen to Clíona's figure, but certainly hopefully into the future that will happen more and more. And I'm sure Tony might want to add something to the discussion around technology and the role of technology in this situation that we're finding ourselves in.
Yeah, thanks, Manuela. And just to pick up the great points made by Cornelia and our other colleagues, I suppose we've been looking at the literature recently in technology and education, and again, a colleague, Chuck Hodges at Georgia Southern University, we could find one paper which mentioned pandemics. It was in 2010 by Parker White, and it was just one line in a paper. So it's really unprecedented, but in some ways not, as I said at the top there, in 1918 we had the flu pandemic, which was pretty calamitous for the planet and for humanity. And also, I think in terms of looking at technology, it's interesting looking at one of our commentators on Facebook, on the Zoom call, has talked about progressive education. And one of the leaders of that area in the 60s, Ivan Illich, who was what we would call a deschooling philosopher, he was interested in removing some of the, I suppose, the more erroneous or problematic aspects of school out of society. And he talked about what he called learning webs, which was almost like talking presciently about the internet today and how it's been used in society and education to connect people and been used for learning and teaching. But we can look at some of the other historical moments as well. We'll take Reggio Emilia in Italy, which sadly has been one of the most affected areas by this current pandemic. And after World War II, the people of the locale of the region and teachers and parents and the kids themselves wanted a different type of education, particularly after the calamitous events of World War II and the death and pestilence and etc., which had been visited on people. And they decided to completely change and rethink their educational approach. Now, as Cornelia rightly says, this isn't a time for assessing or benchmarking things per se. It's an emergency situation, and we have to move cautiously there as well. We're all trying to adapt in this new world post-pandemic or mid-pandemic. But what was interesting was that they emphasized and foregrounded in Reggio Emilia what they call the 100 languages of the child. And it really was a very holistic approach to education. And it goes back to some of the things Ian was talking about earlier, like home crafts and play and our mental health, as Clíona said at the top as well, the importance of our mental health and well-being, particularly at the moment where there's such a dislocation. And interestingly, after the flu pandemic in 1918, many kids reported, and these are getting published now in the New Yorker and the Atlantic and other magazines, they reported not being able to wait to get back to school, which for many of us, going back to school often is a bit of a wrench. So, certainly returning to normal, we'll have to see what that will be as well, because we can't, as the minister said yesterday, it would be to live in a fool's paradise to predict too strongly what's going to happen, because we're still, and as Professor Carey said in his piece in Brainstorm, we need social scientists as well as scientists, but we need both, all scientists, all researchers, learners, teachers are important here, because we have to find the solution together. And as Mike Ryan in the WHO said rightly as well, none of us is safe until all of us are safe with this virus. So safety and security of young people and teachers and parents and families has to be paramount as we move forward. And
maybe I can just pick up on that, the new normal, we hear that a lot, but in relation to education now with this, what it's looking like, we might be only back in September. And Clíona, I was a little bit taken aback when you said that would mean they would be out of school for 6 months. I mean, that's a very long time and a lot happens. So I'd like to really bring this, ask Clíona the question from a sociological perspective and thinking about educational disadvantage. What are the possible implications here, or what do we need to keep an eye on or be aware of or try to fix? It's surely not just technology or devices, which is something that has been addressed, but what are other areas that really are at risk at the moment?
Yeah, I think what's really helpful to consider is, there's research done on what's called summer learning loss, which is the idea that, in the months of the summer holidays, there's a fall in educational achievement or educational attainment, and the widening of that gap between where people are at, where students are at the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer, is greater for students from marginalized groups, from lower socioeconomic groups. So, that is something, if that's the case in summer holidays, then if you stretch that over 6 months, of course there's going to be implications there. And yet, there's, as I mentioned, there's particular groups that are going to be more affected than others. Students from traveller communities in Ireland, students from traveller communities, students in direct provision, students who are homeless. But then there's also students with special educational needs and students with English as an additional language. And each of those groups have, they have different needs and different requirements. So, if anything, it's this lack of consistency across schools that is an issue. And a lot of the conversation around tech and supporting students with digital technology is presuming that students even have access to technology. In many cases, students are accessing resources on a mobile phone, using mobile data, if even that. With free school meal deliveries, work packs are being delivered to students in DEIS schools. Some students don't have copybooks, don't have pencils. So, there's a lot of very practical questions to address. But one thing that concerns me, and possibly in this conversation, is where the burden of responsibility for students learning in this period actually falls. And the idea that that's becoming individualized and pushed back on parents and pushed back on families. And there's a risk that there'll be a perception that the fault lies somehow with the parents if they're not doing enough to support a child's learning. And this is the case for all groups, of course, but it's particularly problematic when you look at it from a social and cultural perspective, where there's a risk that we tend towards this deficit model of parents who, for whatever reason, are not in a position to provide for continuity of their children's learning. So I think certainly we can address these practical steps, and the DES and schools are addressing the practical steps, but at the same time we need to take a step backwards and think about the burden of responsibility for parents and where the responsibility for the learning lies. And again, that goes into the more, the social and the emotional aspect of it. I think that needs attention, certainly.
Thank you so much, Clíona. Maybe just for last question to the panel before we open for questions and answers to all our participants. What would you see, what maybe possible positive opportunities that we can potentially gain from this crisis? Also looking back at the historical context, Tony, that you've been talking about.
Yeah, certainly I think that it's highlighted how important education is at home and now as well outside of school, informal learning, as well as in the classroom. And I think it's valuing, and again, we can maybe draw inspiration from Reggio Emilia, for example, in the 100 languages of the child, that education and learning means more than, as Ian said, the performative meeting of assessment requirements as well. And I was reading recently Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, his essay from the 1930s in praise of idleness. And he talks interestingly about when we have time. Now, again, this isn't exactly a leisure time that we have, but filling our time with creative activities and things that enrich us. And certainly that we'll have to, necessity is the mother of invention, we'll have to find, and as one of our contributors has said online, returning to life and away from formal education in some ways is a radical thing as well. I think Ian wants to pick up a point there too, but certainly that we can, nurture our creativity at this time, and we'll have to be, and again, Bertrand Russell makes the point that the point of education itself is for us to spend our leisure time creatively.
Okay, thanks very much. And we go to Ian, who wants to make another point in relation to possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I briefly mentioned the uncanny experience of the world that we have now. I think that may generate good things for how we look at everything, really, potentially. I mean, we can perhaps switch into a new normal, or perhaps we will switch back and try and repress it. But the fact that we have been made aware of the ordinary things we would never have thought about, that would be ready to hand in Heidegger's terms, surely has kind of implication, or educational implications, or implications more generally about how society could be improved, how education could be improved. So that kind of way in which we can be pulled away from our ordinary concerns and somehow could become something quite powerful in regards to where we go with education.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to open this session now for questions from our participants. There's a few comments already that we have on our chat, which I think everybody can see. Reading the first comment there, just to really commend the teachers and the immense work that some of the teachers have been putting in. There's one teacher describing how schools are trying really every way to get in contact with parents and I guess deliver work, provide feedback on work via email, delivering it to the house and so on. It's certainly difficult in these situations of social distancing to even get information from one point to another. But I think really it is a difficult situation whereby children, and maybe sometimes very young children, are asked to complete a lot of independent work themselves, and often with very, very little feedback or encouragement, which is something that from a developmental perspective, the children at these ages wouldn't really be experienced in, or potentially not even able for. So I think that really raises a lot of questions, particularly where children have no home support. So if you can pose your questions now, that would be great. There's also a real interesting comment. I don't know if somebody would like to say something about this, about the blurring of the roles of teachers and parents. Certainly something I can really relate to as a parent. Teachers and parents and the relationship boundaries are being blurred with parents, stating that they feel phone calls and home visits may be intrusive. However, schools are being instructed by the DES to contact schools and pupils. So there's a lot of different, I guess, expectations and new boundaries that need to be crossed very quickly without an understanding being formed. And I'm sure there's, uncertainties on all sides, on the sides of the parents, the children, and the teachers. So from my personal perspective, we should look at really the needs of the students first and foremost, but it's not in practical terms always that easy. We have I think there's an interesting point to be made about the precarious nature of employment for educators at all levels. Educators expected to now go online and provide teaching and assessment online, etc. For example, at third level with the number of precarious staff, particularly hourly staff, and certainly that is the same situation in second level teaching and primary teaching. The change is hugely unequal. Now these precarious staff need the equipment and skills to change their teaching provision while being underpaid and in insecure working practices. And if they have any caring responsibilities, this is really widening the gap of access. Would somebody like to respond to this? I guess the situation that teachers find themselves in now, and many teachers who have no permanent employment or maybe even just hourly contracts. Clíona, I can't.
Yeah, I suppose, and that's, our conversation has focused very much on kind of, compulsory schooling or, primary and second level schooling, but, in terms of third level, especially precarious employment is an issue. And, we see particularly, postdoctoral researchers, people who are employed by universities whose, research is on pause. There's a very, there's uncertainty around what direction they're going to go. I think at the school level, in terms of teachers' performance, if you like, there's an anxiousness, certainly with teachers I've been speaking to, there's anxiousness in that they have to be seen to perform, seen to care for their students, seen to do as much as possible. But then on the other hand, this is causing problems for parents because it's, it's a burden, it's too much. So there's a balance to be struck there between teachers needing to, needing to have as much output as possible, but parents not being able to respond to that. And I think another issue, certainly in terms of teachers' continuity of employment, is that there is so much uncertainty around what the transition back to school in September is going to look like. How many, and in terms of schools planning for that return, and in terms of recruitment, there's certainly difficulty for school management in that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how will it all be managed really is very difficult to imagine, particularly for primary school children, to actually put in place measures that will ensure social distancing, which in itself I think raises question, is that even good for the children to experience, and what will it teach them? Any other comments in relation to the role of the teacher? Maybe if we can talk a little bit more about that. I think this time really makes us think about because one of the most important things, I guess, when I was asking at the start, what is it that is missing now? It's, of course, it's the kids' friends, but it also really is their teacher. And again, that's probably more pronounced in primary schools where they're very close to one teacher for the whole year. But what does that mean now for the students in terms of not having this either very irregular, or even some students having had no contact with their teacher since schools have closed?
So if anything, it brings into focus, doesn't it, just from the point of view of my area, which is teacher professionalism, that there's been a challenge, increasingly in terms of teaching being perceived as just facilitation of learning, that you're just providing the work and that the students have to do, and that there's no more to being a teacher than to facilitate that learning. Whereas we're seeing now with this focus on students missing relationships, missing the social aspect of schooling, missing the person that the teacher is, we're maybe seeing a broadening out or more of a recognition of the holistic role of the teacher and how important the teacher is in terms of the personal relationship that they have with students. So that could be something, in terms of striking an optimistic note, that maybe we might move away from thinking that any person in front of a class will achieve the same thing from that group of students. That the person themselves and the core of the person themselves, that is the teacher, is important. So that's possibly a note of optimism here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of optimism in terms of maybe the recognition of the role of the teacher and the important work that they are doing, and the important place that they're playing in the children's lives. I have one question here in relation to examinations. I guess it is very interesting, and I know there have been a lot of discussion in Germany. That a report recommended that actually younger children should be the ones to go back to school first, because they're the least likely to be able to work independently. But of course, there's all the social distancing problems arising with that. So really, there has been a bit of discussion who should come back first. first and who shouldn't. And what we are seeming to see in Ireland, but also in other countries, is that exam years are the first to come back into education. So we're educating them for the exams. So really, what do you think about that? And then we have a question here that relates to exams. Third level is preparing for paperless exams, and how far away are we from paperless exams for the Leaving Cert?
Well, it was interesting actually this year. Computer science was to be a computer-based exam, so the first for the State Exams Commission. But obviously now we're not so sure of that. But perhaps it is something that's coming down the line that the State Exams Commission are working on. Time will tell.
What do you think, Tony, about paperless exams for the Leaving Certificate? What would be benefits and challenges currently?
I think the pivot to technology and thinking about digital assessment in that context opens the conversation around what we're assessing in the Leaving Certificate. And I think it's really interesting, Manuela, as you say, in Germany, for example, where younger kids are going to be prioritized. I suppose a worry for a lot of younger children in Ireland and teenagers as well at junior cycle is that will there be a privileging of the Leaving Certificate when we do, as it were, return to formal school? And we have to have that debate again around, making sure that education is accessible for all and that there's equity in how we return to what it is education will be after we can, with social distancing as well. But I do think that the digital education, digital assessment, like Cornelia said with the new computer science subject, piloting online assessment, it opens the door. As technology has often been, again, I mentioned Illich earlier, deschooling. A lot of people at that time, and when technology first came into education, saw it not just as a new way to mediate learning and teaching, but actually as a philosophical tool to ask questions around the very nature of education and how it should be undertaken.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I think Ian wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the ways in which we talk about technology, and what I'm about to say is fairly familiar within philosophy of education, that a difference can be made perhaps between the technology itself and a particular kind of technological sensibility that may come in. So I don't know, if you take something just like email, for example, email could have become a new form of letter writing. Instead, email becomes the most effective, efficient way of getting your message across as fast as you possibly can. So there's a sense in which.
Oh, has everybody lost Ian?
I think so.
Ian, you're frozen at the moment, but I think that's a very interesting point to raise, that technology, of course, can be used in many different ways, and maybe this will be an opportunity for us to become more aware and conscious of the different ways. Cornelia?
Yeah, I think just even following on from what Tony and Ian were talking on there, Shoshana Zuboff in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, talks about the division of learning and the division of labour, and questions kind of who is included or excluded from learning and what we're able to learn and how we're able to act on that knowledge. And I think, so, I think that kind of falls into the whole question and the role of the teacher as well, in kind of, we have to be mindful of AI and the increasing space it's having in education, and the implications of even increased datafication in education now. Kind of, it really raises questions about, the human behaviors that we're learning from machines. This might be very much with technology hat on or that, but I think it really does ask questions of us, and really as educators, maybe we need to be more aware. We need to establish the role of formal education in this era of ubiquitous learning, by machines, by humans, all of us in the circle.
Yeah, and really to recognize the limitations and the benefits. I guess there's a lot of actually in these times, I think technology sometimes can be a good solution to providing feedback to students. If you think of apps like Duolingo and so on, at least there's some feedback to the students that can't be as immediate from teachers. But I think Cliona wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, it occurs to me in discussing educational technology in this sense, and it reminds me of last week's session on data and ethics, and the idea that there's no certainty that changes brought in now, like changes brought in quickly in reaction to the crisis, will be reversed once the pandemic is under control. So the shift to digital technology, in some ways it could be seen as, this massive education experiment. And the other thing it does strengthen what was already a pretty firm foothold by digital tech corporations in educational spaces. And I think we need to have some attention to that, what we'll be left with of that once this is over. And I wonder as well, about the role of oversight here. These technologies aren't necessarily neutral. And I wonder, are these technologies going to be increasingly used to measure and predict student attainment, even to recommend interventions, as is already the case in certain jurisdictions, not here yet. But I do wonder about that, what we're going to be left with after all this is over.
I think that's a real important point that you're making there, and I would like to welcome Professor Jerry McRourke, who has joined us, our head of school. You're very welcome, Jerry. I have one hand up here actually among our participants, Fiona. So I will put on the microphone for Fiona Quinlan if she could pose her question. I hope this works now. David is somewhere in the background there. Could you assist us, David, so that we can take this question?
He's there.
He's there. Okay. I think Jerry had his hand raised as well. Had you?
It's going back a while. I was talking about when we were talking about the Leaving Cert going as a paperless exercise or a paperless outcome. I think this raises very fundamental questions about the Leaving Cert itself and a situation where we're actually been left with one measure of student outcomes. I know there are some project-based work in it, but I really wonder if it's fit for purpose anymore, and if putting students into that kind of context is really the way to go. And if we're the notion that I thought it was an indictment really of our system when Anya Hyland talked about the fact that we weren't able to deal with predictive grades in our system as a method of measuring student outcomes. I thought that was a bit sad, that we had left ourselves at the mercy of this system that we've had for years, and that we haven't nuanced our assessments to such a degree that we can actually measure students in a different way. I think it really will challenge that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jerry. I think Fiona Quinlan has been unmuted now. Is that right, David? Fiona?
She's gone on us.
I can't hear Fiona. I'm so sorry. She had her hand raised for quite a while.
She might be back in there now.
Could you unmute Fiona, David? I have another question here. So in the meantime, this is, I think, actually a very important question for us to address from Riona. Is the incursion of technology in relation to the increased screen time for primary school children a worry to any of the panelists?
I think that, Manuela, that's a very good question from Riona. And again, what we've seen in the previous seminars, Dr. John Morrissey in the first seminar, and last week again in the data seminar, that this pandemic, it might be it's a new normal, as we're calling it. So the chances of this being a kind of a common precarity that we live in, and might very well be the case. So we're looking at a situation where we're going to be more reliant on technology, which obviously, as Rena rightly says, is going to entail more direct screen time for children. So I think it is a concern. We need to have the balance, and I think, as Ian said earlier, we need to balance that, and Cornelia raised the point, and Clíona as well, in a new kind of blended or hybrid of digital and physical, and how we learn online, but making sure that if this is the new normal that continues on for, well, we hope it's going to be over very soon, but if it doesn't, we need to figure out how we design for that. And Cornelia said it earlier, this isn't a time really for assessing online learning, but still we have to kind of think forward to how we're going to design for learning that's not just going to be predominantly screen-based, and that we start to value. And it goes back to what Jerry just said as well about the Leaving Certificate, and what are we assessing through the Leaving Certificate itself as well. And there's also the assumption with online, and I think it's a concern, that if we're online, we're always online. Email, the tyranny of email, as we often call it, that because we're at the end of an email, we should be responding to these 24/7. And I think it's really important as we move to this new kind of context of using digital technology that we really protect and that we allocate our time where we're not online, and that we kind of protect some of the boundaries that we know are healthy for life and for education as well.
Yeah.
In any school routine, you have break time. It can't entail, and that's probably one of the problems with traditional schooling, and it's an incredible pressure that's on teachers and on students to deliver the curriculum as well. Particularly at the Leaving Cert, they're under incredible pressure to cover material in a finite time. So I do think we need to kind of preserve and really protect the boundaries between the digital and the non-digital.
And I guess it's also very difficult because we don't even know what will be the impacts now on a physical level, and we're not in a situation where we have a lot of access to experts or where everybody can look at this topic at the moment. But certainly, it's something that is very important. I would be personally concerned about the screen time for sure. I wonder even if the type of device probably makes a difference. I mean, looking at a little phone the whole day compared to an iPad or a bigger screen on the computer. So all these things, again, there might be inequities and differences there as well. Cornelia, did you want to add something? Screen time question.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of, remind us all too, that technology should never drive the direction of education or indeed of digital education. So, in any of the designs, the human has to be at the center of the design, and the values of the school or the institution have to be central, even in digital design, a digital education provision, so I think we have to be very careful around that. I think just going back to what Clíona was saying about, even in terms of educational technology priorities, thinking about non-for-profit organizations, the open educational movement, Tunstall talks about like respectful design. So thinking about our most vulnerable users and the design of our educational technology or platforms, like for who does it hurt or who does it benefit? So being mindful of that I think is hugely important. And again, Neil Selwyn talks about care rather than competition, and cooperation rather than rivalry, and imagination rather than this corporate creativity that's sometimes fostered because of a certain device. So I think technology is wonderful, but we see also the challenges that it places, or that it has. So we have to be mindful of that too.
We do, and I think that if I can add to what Cornelia said there about the digital, she mentioned it earlier at the top around the digital use divide. As our colleague Sean O'Grada will often speak to us about, is that it's not so much the access to the device or technology that's the prevailing and important thing. It's knowing how to use it and how best to deploy it, and how best to optimize the functions of the technology for learning. And that's something, and I think there's a question there that has come through as well around early school leaving, and one of the unintended consequences of the change to the junior cycle has been young people who leave at the junior cycle to enter apprenticeships. So we have to be very careful. There are a lot of unintended consequences now in this enforced deschooling, we might call it, these young people, they rely on the fact of having the junior certificate for their apprenticeships. So we have to be very mindful of the many unintended consequences. And as Cornelia rightly says, it's the most vulnerable. And those are we have to have that conscientiousness as we go forward now in education.
I have a question. It relates more to third level, and it's actually a PME student. How will students' assessment be affected by the restrictions from not having access to the university Wi-Fi? So again, this relates to maybe differences in how accessible online study is to different students. And of course, that is something that the universities take into account. So as a quick question, really, I would recommend that you contact your program director with any queries and find out what supports are available. We have looked at the school leaving question. Clíona, you want?
Yeah, no, I was actually just briefly on that school leaving question. I think that's something that gets forgotten in this, panic to, talk about returning to schooling and what we're going to do and spacing out the desks and hand washing, etc. It's going to be a huge cohort of students, those already experiencing school refusal or at risk of dropping out, who just won't make that transition back to formal education. And we need to look at what resources or what supports are available for those students. And, and then outside the Irish context, we've focused very much here on the Irish context, but, UNESCO's latest figure, I think it's 1.3 billion learners out of school. So if we look at the Global South, if we look at a prolonged period of school closure in the Global South, and particularly for girls in education, there's going to be huge cohorts that don't return to schools at all. That's going to affect, the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is a much broader conversation. Absolutely.
And I think it really is a time where teachers themselves, and we have been talking about the role of teachers before, but teachers themselves are wondering how their roles might yet again be expanding. There's a question here from Annie Asgard. Yesterday, my colleague spent an hour with a parent who lives in a direct provision centre. She was highly distressed, and how can a teacher help? We are not counsellors, but even a counsellor cannot go and help her in this situation. She and her family of 4 are still in the one room all together for the last 6 weeks and into the foreseeable future. Also, this is during Ramadan. So, huge, I guess, worries for teachers as well, for their students, where people are in very difficult situations. And we know from some research that these drastic and dramatic changes for children can have long-term psychological impact, besides their learning being impaired. So any comments on that?
Yeah, if I could add to what you said, Manuela, in terms of if the history of education in Ireland and internationally has taught us anything, is you have to address economic and social exclusion and disadvantage. New curricula, new CPD for teachers, new technologies are great, but you have to, and again, Donogh O'Malley in 1966, and the report, the Investment in Education report, in 1962 to 1965 highlighted that, and the government were well aware that you had to address economic exclusion and disadvantage. That was partly why they had the bus scheme to bus kids from rural areas so they could actually physically attend school. So I think that very important question that's been raised online, you have to address underlying social and economic exclusion, and education then will function well, but you have to address that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we are nearly coming to the hour. Would anybody like to add anything? Maybe any advice for parents, teachers, schools, or questions that we need to consider going forward? No. Okay, so I would like to thank all the panelists for the very interesting points everybody has made and our discussions, and I will hand over to Den to close the session. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thanks, Manuela.
Thank you, Manuela.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to see if I can get my video to come back. David may have to release me so I can be seen. But first of all, really just to thank you so much for really I think a tremendously interesting discussion, interesting and important. We've covered so much valuable ground. I've been taking notes as you're speaking, and I really think that there ought to be a wider public forum and dissemination of this work. The good news is that the video of this session will be available, and I would strongly encourage people to try to send it out and get the word out there. It'll be available on our Moore Institute webpage. Thank you again. And I think it's really the start of a very valuable national discussion and collective communal discussion about where we want to go with education at primary and secondary and at third level. And more generally, what are we aiming for? So thank you again. Just to point out that we have a seminar coming up on Monday evening. This one will take place at 8 p.m., so a different time. And the writer Mike McCormick, who's a colleague of ours here, is going to be speaking with Sinead Gleason and Mark O'Connell on the experience of writers during the COVID-19 crisis and how it's affected their work. So you can find the details on the Moore Institute webpage. But again, thank you to all for participating. I appreciate it very much.